Hello. Welcome back. It's time for Leading Women in Tech. I am your host, Tony Collis, and today we're talking about all things leadership, success, being a woman in the world of tech, and importantly, showing vulnerability. I want to talk about what does it mean to be vulnerable? How can we embrace openness to create stronger connections with our team and our peers? If you're new to a leadership position, particularly if you're early on in your career, you may feel like you are needing to be confident all the time. You need to demonstrate and express emotions that show you belong, that show you're important in this role, that you have complete confidence all the time. It's a powerful way to foster trust, create a positive environment. Here's the thing. Early on in my career, I learned there's also a massive importance to being vulnerable with my team, to showing that there are times when I'm not as confident or when something isn't going the way I wanted it to. At the time I'm thinking of, I was facing a personal challenge. It was affecting my work performance. I was dealing with a family crisis that was consuming my energy and focus. Initially, I tried to keep it hidden from my team. My boss knew. My boss was one of these bosses who was very much removed from me managing my team. But I feared that if I shared with my team, I'd seem weak. If I opened up to them and told them what was going on, I would demonstrate that I wasn't fully present, that I wasn't here for their hard choices and challenges and discussions. I thought it would weaken my position. But inevitably, as I'm sure you've all experienced, the stress becomes too much. And so I decided to share my situation with my team. And this was the day that my attitude towards vulnerability changed. And you may well have had something like this as well, but I want you to take this as a nugget for maybe being even more vulnerable. My team responded with incredible support. They stepped up. They helped me with my workload. They offered emotional support and camaraderie. This experience so early on, and something that incredibly stressful, but wasn't world ending for me. It was just a lot was going on with my family. Thankfully, nothing that meant somebody was going to be dying or anything like that. But it gave me permission. And now when more serious things happen, to open up about my vulnerabilities. Because the other thing that it does is foster compassion and a supportive work environment. It gave the rest of my team permission to be vulnerable. It reminded me that none of us are invincible. We're human. It's okay. And it reminded my team of that too. I think one of the reasons why I was so reluctant to share, because I wasn't seeing this in my workplace. I didn't have role models who were sharing in the same way. This was this perception of you show up to be the leader and you leave all that out there somewhere else. As soon as I started showing up, being more vulnerable, showing that, hey, I have a life that sometimes is a bit of a hot mess, has things that happen that are uncomfortable and painful, my team felt able to open up. So I knew what was going on with them. It makes you more compassionate as a leader if you know this person's having a bad week. When one of my team was going through a divorce, I understood when they had a bad day. It wasn't an excuse for bad behavior, but I understood that they weren't on point. When somebody else had a miscarriage, I was honored to be shared with that information, something that I never expect somebody to share. It's such a private and personal thing, or there's a debate to be had whether we should be keeping it that personal private, but for right now in our current society, it is. But to be able to hold space for that person through what is a crippling pain, an emotional shock, I just think it's such an honor and a privilege and a way to make sure that they come back faster. But if you aren't showing your vulnerability, you don't have that individual rapport already with your team. Why would they share with you their individual concerns? Why would they share with you what's going on in their lives? Why would they share with you that they're struggling with the job you've just given them, taking away all the personal stuff? When we share, when we say, hey, I'm struggling, I don't know how to solve this problem, or my personal life, something's going on here, we're saying, I'm here for you too, because we're not on doing this on our own. When I share information, It is always with a level of prudence, though. So today, I will actively think about the level of detail I want to give. I want to give my team an understanding of the support I need and what perhaps is needed around me, where I may well be having a bad day, so I'm not on point, and I'm asking for a little bit more grace. But there's a limit to how much is useful to be sharing. And that's what I want to get into today. The power of vulnerability in leadership, the difference between authentic and inauthentic leadership vulnerability, because it's a very different thing. You probably have seen people being inauthentic vulnerably, and it is a weird feeling. You're like, I don't know why they're sharing this. And I'll give you some practical strategies for embracing vulnerability without that diminishing overexposure. So to start, let's remember vulnerability in this context is about being open about challenges and uncertainties, whether they're personal or professional. It's crucial for us to build trust, foster those deep connections with a culture of openness and continuous improvement. This is sharing because you are professional, not in spite of it. Remember as women that we do have a unique experience. We have been indoctrinated to what it's like to be a woman in the Western world, if you live in the Western world. And that means we have unique perspectives and strengths because of that lived experience. We can debate whether it's nature or nurture, but the reality is we do operate on average differently because of our lived experience. And so when we bring this vulnerability, when we embrace it, it's beneficial for everyone and not a sign of weakness. I think this is the thing we do. We go on the back foot. We think, oh, as a woman, I'm going to get taken apart for being vulnerable. I'll be told I'm emotional. I bring too much to work. The reality is when we bring this vulnerability, we express it in an organic, genuine way. We're saying you have permission to be a whole human. Men are whole humans as well. Every gender is. It's just the historical, I'm going to use the word bro culture. Apologies for that if that's triggering to you. But that historical culture has meant it's not been okay to bring your whole self to work. One of the things we are seeing in society is as we're embracing what I would call more feminine leadership, irrespective of your gender, by the way, men are able to show up more as themselves. We're seeing that men are able to do more childcare simply because as women, we've had to make sure it's happened. Men are now taking advantage of it. And this is one of those things where women are bringing the conversation, but it shapes the entire organization and makes everything better. It fosters a more supportive environment. When we're authentically vulnerable, it is an organic response to a situation. Sometimes it's when we least expect it. We're vulnerable without realizing we're being vulnerable. But when we are inauthentically vulnerable, it can quite often be involving manipulation. And if we do this badly, we lose the trust of our team. There's a feeling of insecurity. You may understand that vulnerability is important. And if you feel this push to create vulnerability, to share, it's going to be inauthentic because it means it's not coming from an authentic place. And while I want you to be prudent, I want you to have executive presence and therefore be mindful of what you're saying. It should be organic. It should come from, my team needs to hear this today because this is going on. It's impacting me and I need support, or they need to know I'm not going to be on point today, this week, this month. But at the same time, if you've been planning it for 3 weeks because you need to be vulnerable, you're going to end up killing the very environment you're trying to create. This should come from an innate desire to make sure that you are supported and demonstrate to your team that they can ask the same kind of support rather than, I need to be vulnerable so everybody else feels that they can be vulnerable. That is not the reason to do this. You should be vulnerable so people know what's going on because it's good, not be vulnerable because you want everybody else to be vulnerable. If you do that, it's going to be forced. It's not going to feel right. A while ago, I was working with a client who was afraid to admit her mistakes about project timeline estimations. Common issue. So many of us experience. When we had a discussion about it and she had the courage and the tools to go in and discuss what went wrong and how it impacted her team, owning she had made mistakes, that the timeline had gone off whack, she then invited the team to brainstorm solutions with her. So she was vulnerable by showing up and saying, hey, I got this wrong. We messed up because I got this wrong. But then she said to the team, hey, I need help. Let's brainstorm ways to avoid similar mistakes in the future. And she learned from that everybody else was involved in this. They were passionate about this. This meant that my client built trust and credibility and created this culture of openness. She owned her mistake and she owned continuous improvement and learning from the mistake. She was vulnerable, learned from it, got the team to learn from it, and demonstrated firsthand that it's okay. It's okay to make a mistake. It's okay to take risks. It's okay to learn from them. The key thing is how you get back up afterwards. By being vulnerable, she demonstrated that. Before we worked on this, she would have admitted the mistake, but out of fear, and quickly focused on shifting the blame to external factors. If you've ever found yourself going, this happened, but that's what we're talking about here. We all do this because there's always extenuating circumstances, always. But ultimately, you want to have that deep conversation with yourself and say, yes, but also how much of this was on me? Should I have anticipated that? When we can learn to truly own our mistakes, hopefully because there isn't a culture of fear, because there isn't a culture of blame or anything like that, and taking somebody down because they made a mistake, this is when we can really grow. When we're defensive, we can't take full responsibility. There's no genuineness when we do say, I got this wrong. It's all about a lack of trust and respect and pushing onto something or someone else. And therefore your team learns it's not safe to fail and they shouldn't own their mistakes, which guess what? They're not going to come to you with their mistakes. It creates this culture of blame, shifting and defensiveness, and it becomes very unhealthy very quickly. Another client I worked with several years ago was struggling with balancing work and personal, right? Who hasn't struggled with that? She was overwhelmed. It was affecting her focus, her performance. After discussing with me what she could do, she found the courage to open up to her team about what she was going through. She explained how the stress was impacting her and asked for their understanding and support as she worked through it, something I think more of us should do more often. But she also invited her team to share if they were facing similar challenges. Initially in a one-on-one situation, but then if they felt willing, do it in a team situation. What this meant was there was an openness, a sense of empathy and support within her team. It encouraged them all to share with each other their struggles. It helped reduce the stigma around mental health, something we all need to urgently do more of. And as a result, the team bonded. They became stronger together. There was a deeper level of trust because they had more understanding. Rather than sitting there being frustrated at your teammate who's not delivering, you suddenly go, they're not delivering this week because of that. If we don't know why somebody's not delivering, it immediately becomes frustrating. It is an excuse for somebody to not deliver at all. But when there is an understanding, we have more empathy and our stress goes down, which means we deliver more. If we understand why that's happening, we deliver better. So overall, the team is lifted up. Before my client and I worked together on this, she had a very different approach. During team meetings, she would vaguely mention that she'd been really stressed out lately, but she wouldn't give any context or details about her stress. This is inauthentic vulnerability. She knew she had to say something, but was very vague, and it comes across as just making excuses. Saying that she's stressed, but not elaborating. So she'd really want to be moving the conversation to how the team needed to work hard to meet deadlines. So she was saying, I'm stressed, I'm not coping, but we need to work really hard to meet this deadline. Her admission felt more like an afterthought than a genuine sharing of her struggles. When we do this, we come across as insincere, we come across as dismissive, and it failed to build that empathy, that connection, leaving us all feeling unsupported and unimportant. If you've ever experienced that, it is painful to be in the room with. If instead we can create that openness, people aren't reluctant to share. People believe there's trust. People believe there's genuine concern and support for whatever we're going through. But if you can't demonstrate it yourself, why would they? When we are operating this way, when we are authentically vulnerable, it's incredible. It's important to strike this balance between being vulnerable but maintaining authority, because this is the final piece of this puzzle in my mind. Being able to balance being vulnerable with being an authority can be hard for many of us. If you've never done this before, it can feel like the difference between venting and ranting or being vulnerable in such a way that everybody still wants to follow you. So for example, if you come in every day, and I've had colleagues do this, and it's exhausting. And I'm going to do something that's very stereotypically done by mums. So apologies if this is triggering. But if you come in every day complaining about your kids or seeming every day that you're all over the place, blaming external issues, particularly family or personal life, it will undermine your leadership. I used to say it can, but it will. If you do this enough, your colleagues aren't your therapist. They aren't your best friend. They are therefore not here for complaining to. You're coming in and complaining. You're treating them as that person that you need a good complaining session to. And you come across as unreliable. You come across as the person who just complains about everything in their life. But equally, you do need to say things aren't going well right now. But this balance takes practice. It takes owning your own experiences, acknowledging that you have negative feelings without letting those feelings define who you are. It means holding executive presence. It's a balance between sharing vulnerably, but also sharing what you've learned about it. Without this balance, you come across massive pitfalls. You are perceived as weak. You're perceived as potentially a gossip, because sometimes when we're doing this, we come across as gossipy if it's about other people in the organization that are letting you down. You can come across as the person who shares too much too often about personal struggles, who is unstable and unreliable. People begin to question your ability to lead because you aren't dealing with your personal life. So how can you possibly deal here? And I think this has put us on the back feet as women because we do have more pressures than men, both personally and professionally. It is not a 50-50 world. Not at this point. We're getting better, but it's slow. Don't get me wrong. There are some men who take on more than their fair share. But on average, as women, we take on more of the home life. And at work, we're on the back foot because we have greater expectations placed on us. And it's not a fair playing field. So we're under more pressure. And that means that we have to work harder at overcoming these quite understandable pitfalls, getting that delicate balance between vulnerability and authority when you are just burnt out, potentially. And this is another part of this. All too often I see us burning out in this situation. We're venting and venting and venting, but nothing's getting better. In fact, things are getting worse because people aren't trusting us. And then we burn out because our stress goes up because we can tell there's a lack of trust. We can tell people aren't giving us the decision-making power we deserve. We can tell that our team doesn't believe in us. They start pushing back on us. And we end up on the back foot, which ramps up our stress and our burnout, which is already there because of what's going on personally that we're complaining about, just ramps up and up and up. And it all started because it's unfair on us to have this burden. I'm asking you to break out of this cycle. It reminds me of another situation where I had another client came to me. She was really struggling with this vulnerable authority balance. She asked me for help. As a senior product manager at a tech startup, she was known for being really innovative. She was a great leader, but one that pushed ideas and was moving this company to really big things. But she had a personal setback that affected her focus and energy. And what it meant was she wanted to come in and tell her team, but she was really concerned about coming across too vulnerable and losing the confidence in the team, partly because in a previous role, she'd overshared and it had backfired. So in this new company she was in, she had been there for a couple of years, but she was very closed off. She didn't share. While I was helping her, we worked on a strategy to address this. During a weekly team meeting, she decided to share the specific challenges. She briefly mentioned the personal struggles. She was specific but brief, how they were impacting her at work. Then she took the time to reassure the team that she was taking steps to manage the situation. At the end of the day, she's the leader in the room. And she has to lead the path through this personal situation, even if she's asking for help. You've still got to be the leader in the room. So she outlined her plan to improve her time management, reduce her stress levels, including with working with me as her coach. She mentioned that she had a coach. And then she asked for their help. she said, I've got a plan, but I now need your help. She wanted some tasks redistributing temporarily. And actually what it meant in the long term was some of the stuff that she redistributed, her team stepped up. This is something I'm so passionate about. When you level up your team, you're going to level up yourself. And that means you can take on more and get promoted, right? That's a whole nother topic for another podcast. But what she was able to do is she redistributed several things. She coached the individuals in how to step up, to turn up to meetings, to own deliverables, making sure different projects were on track that she'd previously owned, because she needed them to step up. And they embraced it. They were excited. She made sure that the things that she kept doing was having that open dialogue. She had a lot of stuff taken off her plate to cope, but she made sure the things she kept was coaching her team. She was actually going through my coach training at the same time, which really helped her because she was training as a coach. So she knew how to level up her team really, really well as a result of this. That meant there was this deeper sense of trust, camaraderie in her team. Her team started sharing their struggles. Everybody became more relatable and approachable. But at the same time, the team leveled up. They took ownership of and roles that they hadn't done before. The entire team, as a result of her being vulnerable and asking for input and help with her workload, leveled up. They delivered more. That meant that she had this brain space to deal with what was going on personally. And then when she was able to come back in, she did not take that stuff back off. And that wasn't our plan when we went through this, but it was a beautiful side effect because she'd come to work with me to talk about executive presence, workload, stress, but ultimately her goal was to get a promotion. The best way to get a promotion is to up-level your team, then demonstrate you can all take on more. She did this through her stress. She did this through a very painful personal episode, not intentionally, but because of how she showed up and up-leveled her team, so that when that episode moved on, the entire team had up-leveled. They took on more. Within 6 months, she got promoted, as did her direct reports. And it's just such a beautiful story. I'm not saying that you should be aiming for that, but it shows you how when you start being open and honest, acknowledging your feelings and fears, being honest with yourself first, then honest with your team rather than suppressing everything, asking for support, magic happens. And the next strategy I want to talk about here is self-compassion. When we show up with self-compassion, when we treat ourselves with kindness, with understanding, especially when you're feeling vulnerable or exposed, if you make a mistake at work, you feel embarrassed, you're being hard on yourself. If you are compassionate, you remind yourself that everyone makes mistakes and then focus on what you can learn from that experience. When you practice that self-compassion, you build resilience. You build self-confidence. Bizarrely, confidence comes from being patient with yourself. It always comes from taking action, but part of the action here is mistakes happen. What can I learn? If you are focused on what's going wrong, so this is particularly a strategy for vulnerability when it's something in the workplace, you're feeling vulnerable because a mistake has been made rather than being something personal outside the workplace that's impacting you. You're saying, I'm going to improve here because this happened. You're learning how to navigate challenging situations with more ease. And then you reframe vulnerability as a strength rather than a weakness. Instead of coming to something ashamed of it, you view it as courageousness. It allows you to be authentic and connect with others and say, I got this wrong, but I'm picking myself back up and here's what I've learned. You are leading a team and showing them that you can make tough decisions. Sometimes you'll take risks and they won't plan out, but you're going to be vulnerable and share your thought process on why you made the decision in the first place. You're not going to shut down and blame everything else when it goes wrong. Instead, you're going to be connected to your decision making, be vulnerable in the way you did that, and be vulnerable in the fact that it didn't go to plan, but that you've reevaluated. So you can pivot earlier when you made a mistake, not pivot too early, right? There's a delicate balance there. And then at the same time, you're sharing with the team how you grew from it. If you want your team to grow and take risks and learn, you've got to demonstrate that, which means being vulnerable. Another strategy with vulnerability is about boundaries. While I want you to be open and honest about your vulnerabilities, you need to protect yourself from being hurt or taken advantage of. So you've got to be comfortable being vulnerable, while not sharing too much personal information. So for example, if you're comfortable sharing some topics, you've got to know whether or not everybody else that's impacted by those topics are off limit. You've got to understand your limitations as well as others. So particularly if you're sharing a story that involves colleagues or family, you've got to know if there's something that you aren't prepared to share. Some things may be very obvious. So for example, if you are sharing something, I'm going to go back to the previous example. Apologies if this is triggering to you, but I think it's important that we can have these honest conversations. Something as painful as miscarriage. Be aware that some people in the room, if they've recently been through that and don't feel able to share, it can be very triggering in the same way that this is. And I hope I gave you enough of a trigger warning there. But imagine being faced with that in a team meeting. Equally, what if your spouse worked in your workplace and decided to share that you'd had a miscarriage? Maybe that's a step too far. That's a really obvious one because it's so triggering and so painful for so many of us. But there are going to be other things like that where for you, you might be willing to share, but it crosses the line either for somebody else that's involved directly or somebody else that might be triggered. You're not going to get everything right. You're just not. But be mindful of what you share and have boundaries and a sense of safety and trust in your relationships. One of the things I like to do is share in onion layers. The most obvious is to share with your direct boss if you feel safe in that relationship, because they probably need to know something's going on. You might, if you don't feel super safe, you might not be able to share all the details. But then you might think, well, can I share with the next day out? Is there something that I need support in? It might be that you need support, but you're not prepared to share the topic for whatever reason. So you can share, like, there's something I can't share with you, but I'm struggling right now with this, this, and this. Time management, overload, burnout, because there's something that's going on in my personal life that I don't want to talk about. I need some help. And provided you've got a history of sharing vulnerably about other things, yes, they might be like, well, what's going on there? But then most of them will recognize there are limits. So acknowledge your feelings, practice that self-compassion, reframe vulnerability as a strength, and have those boundaries. When we embrace vulnerability, our team productivity goes up, retention goes up, innovation goes up, simply because people feel more able to be themselves at work. That productivity piece is really, really key. And I'm hoping that example I gave you earlier highlights this. But when our team has permission to be vulnerable, they're more likely to share their ideas and concerns openly. They know there's effective collaboration and problem solving, and they know they can make mistakes. They know they can come and say, there's an approach here I'd like to take, but there's a risk involved. Can we discuss it? They're not afraid of showing that risks are something to be considered. And when we do that, we improve retention. There's increasing belonging and loyalty. Your team is going to feel that they can personally bring themselves to work, but also that they're all engaged and motivated to show up and have interesting ideas, take risks, share bold ideas without judgment, and have breakthrough innovations, but also be ready to pick themselves up and have those uncomfortable learning conversations that actually lead to more innovation rather than that went wrong, blame everything else and not learning from it. When we don't learn from our mistakes, when we don't learn from the failures, we stop innovating. The failures, in my mind, are where the real innovation comes from, because you learn so much from failing. There's a lot that I've just covered in this episode, but I'm hoping you're feeling more value to breaking down the barriers around sharing, embracing vulnerability. I hope sharing just a little bit of some of my client stories, my own personal journey, will help you feel vulnerable enough to step up and share some of this yourself, confident enough that you will be okay, and understand that trust, deep connections, and a culture of openness and continuous improvement comes from how you start showing up. I want you to step forward starting today with vulnerability. Of course, do pay attention. If you've got a toxic workplace, take care of you first. I don't want you getting yourself in the position where anything you share could be used against you. But always check yourself on that. Sometimes we tell ourselves these stories because of previous experiences that aren't valid in your current workplace. So if you can, embrace vulnerability. I want you to practice understanding your feelings and fears today. Instead of hiding or suppressing them, share a fear with a trusted colleague or friend. This will help you become more comfortable with vulnerability and create a space for others to do the same. And then the second action is practice self-compassion. Starting today, work on having kindness and understanding, especially when you're feeling vulnerable or exposed. Build resilience, build self-confidence simply by being kind to yourself. So simple to say, actually quite hard to do. To do that, I want you to start practicing feelings and fears with somebody you trust. Start practicing self-compassion. If you take those 2 steps today, you're going to start building your authentic vulnerability and get those strong connections, which can ultimately lead to amazing things, let alone just walking away from something like burnout. Let me know how you get on. I always love hearing from you. Drop me a message on LinkedIn if this episode's resonated with you. If you've got a question or a topic you would like us to be talking about, do let me know. But until next time, remember, stay in your tech leadership game. Follow your dreams, because the world really does need that uniqueness that you bring as a leading woman in tech.